So Warhammer 40K 10th edition is official, and Games Workshop have given us an absolutely enormous preview to show off some of the new details. Let's talk about the new models, and a slew of major rules reveals that are really going to shake up the game as we know it. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where it does seem that the rumours are now confirmed. As predicted by most of you guys, it does seem that those Tyranid and Terminator teasers were indeed teeing up to Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Games Workshop has just done the full reveal now at Adepticon, and let's talk through all the things that they showed off. 40k 10th edition has been a bit of an open secret for a while now. A new edition of the game has been coming out every 3 years, and it looks like that's going to be set to go into 10th. The title factions are indeed, as predicted, Space Marines versus Tyranids, and the iconic Space Marine Terminators and the Tyranid Termagants are pretty much the headline models for the new edition. In a nutshell, Games Workshop have confirmed that it is happening in summer. The June to July release window looks like it is pretty likely. We're going to be getting a massive amount of new models for Tyranids versus Space Marines, and they have told us a whole load about the new rules that are coming for them, including free digital indexes initially, and some pretty enormous shake-ups to the way that the game is played, with things like vastly cut down amounts of stratagems, really big changes to datasheets and army construction, and plenty more besides. It's pretty massive stuff, to be honest, so let's get into it. First up, as heavily hinted by those teaser trailers that they had going on over the last few days, we are indeed getting new Space Marine Terminators, bigger, badder, and scarier than before. These Terminators are quite upscaled from the previous ones, as we'll see in just a second, but overall the majority of the feel of them just really doesn't feel that different at all. I guess Games Workshop just felt like they were an iconic model that they didn't really need to mess with. They've still got their iconic Crux Terminators on the left shoulder pad, the silhouette and the helmet are basically the same. Maybe the biggest changes are things to their ranged weaponry. The assault cannon has a fair bit of a different feel to it, maybe a bit more modern and Gatling gun-like. I'd say that overall the models maybe look a little bit more dynamic and sleeker than the previous ones, but to be honest, as resculpts go, I'd say it's not the biggest and most massive change in the world. Perhaps one of the more interesting things that they talked about when they were showcasing them was that they can be either Primaris or Firstborn, either one works. It does seem that they are going for blurring the line between the two in 10th edition. Previously we haven't really had that many miniatures that are debatably one or the other, bar maybe that Black Templars Lieutenant style model. These guys basically have the exact appearance of the standard Firstborn Terminators, but upscaled to be more in keeping with the Primaris range, so they do tower above them a fair bit, as you might expect for ancient technological relics. Here are just a few more shots of the new Terminators. Again, broadly speaking, fairly similar to before. They still have those air vent things on the back. Quite a lot of big, flat, fairly unadorned panels as well. Could be a place for freehand or transfers if you want. Perhaps the more important thing though is the size comparison, and I think it really is quite handy to show them sat alongside a regular Terminator at the moment and a Primaris Space Marine now. Basically these guys are significantly bigger, and compared with most other Terminators in the game, they are going to be making them look rather small. I did think it was kind of interesting in the stream that they said that they're not really going to make the older Terminators feel dwarfed or anything, but to be honest they are pretty massive compared with them, very much being updated to the new scale to fit in with the Primaris, as opposed to any major redesign change. I can't help but think that this does work out very nicely for Games Workshop, make a model that's very similar to the previous one without any huge amount of changes, and because it's on a new scale I'm sure you'll get loads more people buying them rather than any ones that they already had. Still though, on the flip side, I won't disagree that they are very cool. I'm sure I'll be painting up a few of them myself at some point. I'd imagine that the Terminators are going to be in the 10th edition starter set, and against them are going to be at least some Tyranid Termagants. They have shown off 3 of them here. Looks like these guys are going to be the first vanguard of the swarms of the Tyranids, and I had mentioned in multiple previous videos that I would be very surprised if Tyranids got an update and Termagants weren't resculpted, and that does indeed appear to have been the case. These 3 are all armed with their iconic flesh borer. As we'll see from a datasheet later in the video, it does still seem that they can take things like Spine Fists and Devourers as well, so they aren't really losing any war gear. I do think that the sculpt is really quite nice, to be honest. It's basically a fitting update for the standard Termagants in my opinion. The old ones come back from a very, very long time ago. They've got a rather big mold line issue, and are really quite basic and monopose. They don't really feel like that much of a living organism, as opposed to more individual pieces in a swarm. Having a whole load of units exactly the same maybe isn't the worst in a big swarm, I guess, but these ones are certainly far superior on an individual model level, loads more detail, and looking a little bit more lively and savage. They're perhaps a little bit more bipedal than the other ones as well, which were generally more down on all fours. These ones are standing up a little bit, holding their claws aloft. Games Workshop are being quite helpful with their scale comparisons, so we can know where they fit in against the old ones and Space Marines and the like. I would say that the old ones have stood the test of time well. The new ones are definitely far more detailed, while basically keeping the same sort of silhouette as the standard gaunts. They have painted them a bit different here, with a bit more of a pinkish hue, as opposed to the Leviathan scheme in the other one. So far, these are the only miniatures that they've properly shown off for 10th edition 40k. Apparently, Tyranids are going to be really quite spoilt, and as seemed very likely given the Necrons and the Death Guard, they're going to have a massive wave of plastic kits released, probably a whole bunch of new and updated miniatures compared with previously, as well as a bunch of new units besides. It's going to be interesting to see what sort of critters are inside their starter box. I feel like the Termagants are probably going to feature heavily, kind of similar to how the Necron warriors did in theirs. I'm sure we'll get plenty more model previews coming out over the next few days and weeks. Before we get into all the major rules changes, first up we've got a bit more lore. Apparently 10th edition is going to be kicking off focusing on the 4th Tyrannic War. The previous 3 that we've had before are Highfleet, Behemoth, Kraken and Leviathan. This appears like it might be another wing of Leviathan sweeping in from the Galactic West, as they have been teasing in trailers running up to this preview. In general, the Tyranids have mainly been attacking from the Galactic East, such as the Behemoth Highfleet trying to destroy Ultramar, and then Highfleet Kraken sweeping in after a bunch of Genestealer cult insurrections and trying to be a bit more clever, trying to overcome and devour a corrupted Imperium. We don't have a whole ton of details as to the overarching narrative of the conflict. It does look like it's Ultramarines front and centre led by Gilliman though. He features prominently in their promotion and teaser trailer, and I guess it's a fairly major point just in itself that the Tyranids are attacking from both the west and the east. It shows that the bogs are all around the galaxy, a great set of jaws closing on the Imperium, I suppose. Apparently this is the major narrative direction that 40k is going to be taking after the Abaddon, Vashtor and Angron fight, with the line concludes. Aside from new models and new lore though, of course we've got a whole load of updates to the game of 40k itself. Honestly, I wasn't expecting quite as many details from this preview. I thought they'd be fairly sketchy about it, but they have actually run through really quite a lot of the major changes to the game and some of the motivations for why they've made them. Perhaps the thing that they wanted to stress first and foremost was that 40k is going to be a bit simpler. There's multiple different ways in which they're doing this, but basically it does feel like they're reacting to some of the criticism of 9th edition 40k and people struggling to manage with the bloat of the game, particularly not just knowing their own faction's rules, but the massive amount of depth available to every other army. First up, codexes will be a fair bit smaller. The various rule sections aren't going to be quite as big or dense as the ones for 9th edition are. For example, they did specifically call out stratagems, saying that each army would basically have 6 of their own, though they did clarify a few other bits and bobs. Apparently they're trying to shift the emphasis of rules back onto datasheets, so you might still expect to see a fair amount of special rules and extra bits on there. Though overall I would certainly expect there to be fewer rules overall in the game and less layered complexity on 40k. Another way that I strongly suspected that they might change things, as I talked about in that sub-faction video recently, is that when they do make alternate ways to play an army, say different sub-factions, the rule sets that you pick up will basically replace things like stratagems, like in the World Eaters Codex where you had that Army of Renown replacing the main way to play World Eaters. I wouldn't be too surprised if we see a fair few like that, though the ways things like chapters and things might change might be quite big. Otherwise, they have gone through a few other areas which we'll touch on now. Again, the rumours of a big index reset do seem to be the case. Indexes are replacing codexes and will be downloadable and free. There's a couple of big changes to phases of the game, including the morale and psychic phase, major changes to stratagems, army construction and datasheets, and a few more hints for the other ways to play 40k, things like Crusade and Boarding Patrol, but also a bit of a shake-up to the idea of Combat Patrol, and really quite a fun one I think. Going down that list individually, first up the indexes are confirmed to be replacing codexes. I'm sure some people will either be happy or less happy about that, but it is what it is. It does mean that all the layered special rules in 9th edition will be going away, and the way that you'll be able to get your hands on the rules for the models will be to download them digitally, probably off the Warhammer community website. I feel like that does take out a fair bit of the bad feeling about purchasing codex and things and then invalidating them, At least this way they are actually giving you the current rules for the faction for free, though I do suspect that overall they probably will be a lot more simplified and not have the same amount of depth or thought put into them compared with things like the codexes. I'd go by something like the 8th edition indexes, a lot more focus on the core mechanics of Warhammer 40k as opposed to the core mechanics of individual armies doing wildly different things. Apparently we'll also be able to download the core rules for free. Hopefully that is the core rules in a meaningful way this time round. I think that last time they had technically the core rules for free, but none of the actual stuff that you properly need to play the game, things like proper mission rules, or a lot of really basic functional stuff that you need to play 40k other than the raw essentials for the actual turn mechanics. Apparently these indexes will be available to purchase in hard copy book releases as well. Kind of an interesting offering there, actually having the rules and the nuts and bolts for free if you want them, but still being able to support paper copies if you want them too. That's something that Games Workshop haven't really done very much in the past. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I imagine that there will be a fair bit of backlash to the current codexes basically all being gone, particularly if you bought, say, an Astra Militarum or World Eaters codex a couple of months back. As I suspected at the time, those books do seem to have a very, very short shelf life. Hopefully the good things that they brought won't be watered down too badly by these indexes, but I suppose we'll wait and see. Apparently Forge World units will be supported in this whole index drive, so theirs will be available to download as well. I'd guess probably in their own things rather than actually mixed in with their own faction things, but you never know, Games Workshop might have finally married their two alternate rule sets. I think they did also mention that they'd have some sort of functioning army builder from day one as well. This would be really quite impressive if it's actually going to be done. The 9th edition one has had quite a lot of issues so far, and I don't meet many people who use that instead of Battlescribe, but you never know, Games Workshop might eventually be able to overcome their digital woes and actually release something that people use en masse. There's some pretty big shake-ups to the phase system as well. The psychic phase is apparently gone entirely now. The powers are now broken down into the phases in which they're actually used. Things like psychic shooting attacks like Smite will now be used in the shooting phase, which I guess does make sense really, and things like psychic buffing powers will be used in the command phase now. I feel like that fits in with one of the previous rumours that we had. I guess that kind of makes sense. It'll be interesting to see how that interacts with things like transport vehicles and reserves and stuff. Currently, command phase rules can be a bit clunky with those. When you get out of transports or come out of reserve, it does mean that you might not be able to use buffing powers, which is one of their advantages at the moment. Wouldn't be too surprised if they think their way around that though. That has been a bit of a flaw of the current system. Otherwise, I generally hope that they don't mess around with psychic powers too much. I feel like throughout the many editions of 40k, the 8th and 9th edition implementations of them have been perhaps better than most. Mortal wounds and simple denials and things do work pretty well. The other major change is the abolition of the morale phase, so I guess we're now going down to 4 phases: command phase, movement phase, shooting, and assault. Apparently the way that morale works is changing quite a bit as well. Now you won't have any chance to lose models whatsoever, but you do have something called battle shock which happens in the command phase somehow, and while it might not cost you models, it will do other things like degrade your units. They mention that it'll have some sort of knock-on effects to how your units function in game, degrading them somehow, such as perhaps holding objectives, perhaps. I guess that could be another very interesting take on it. Your models don't literally vanish like they do under the current system, but I feel like the imagery is quite good really. Models that are effectively broken and unable to fight quite in the same way as they would. Perhaps they could take some sort of penalty to their damage dealing and things, or not be able to hold an objective or do actions, if that's still a major thing. Stratagems they haven't really given us too many hints on. As mentioned, it sounds like the basic offering will probably be 6 per army, and it does sound that they're probably going to be coming in the indexes, not going to be stripped out entirely. And as with World Eaters and the Disciples of the Red Angel, if you choose to run a specific formation of your army, then you swap out the core ones that you get for 6 completely different ones. I wouldn't be too surprised if this might not necessarily be linked to things like chapters, but might be more linked to formations, like perhaps they might have a first company formation, for example, where you take loads of Terminators and get specific stratagems for them. Or completely theory crafting, it might just be locked to the same way as it is at the moment, say for example Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, or Salamanders or something. Apparently command points will be slightly toned down compared with where they are now, there'll be fewer than there are before. And as well as that, with a confirmation of a rumour that we had previously as well, apparently the common stratagem list is being expanded somehow. These are the ones that are available to every single army, and I feel like it might be quite nice if they put some of the more gotchery type stratagems there. I feel like a previous rumour said that they had Auspex scan as one of the things from that. If everyone has access to it, then people are going to remember it, as opposed to not knowing individual variants on stratagems in each individual faction. I feel like in general that's probably going to be fairly well received by the community, having vast amounts of stratagems for every single army, then more layered on them for expansions and things, was something that was definitely adding to the bloat of 40k, maybe not for all that much gain compared with putting abilities on datasheets. Next up, it sounds like there's going to be some incredibly major changes to army building. I was guessing that we might get something similar to the Arcs of Omen detachment as we have at the moment, but it looks like things are going even more simpler than that, and I'm a little bit apprehensive as to how good an idea that is. Apparently, in your army, you take your warlord, and then rather than having battlefield rolls and things, you get 0 to 3 of most datasheets. They made out like it doesn't really matter whether you've got any heavy support choices competing against each other or anything like that, though you can take more of certain things, like say troops. This looks like it's going down a de-restricted route even more so than the Arcs of Omen ones. I must admit I was a tiny bit apprehensive of that, but it seems to have landed quite well. People still seem to be using troops, for example, and spam is still somewhat controlled. I feel like if they are going down this route, though, they would have to be very careful about balancing every single unit in a book. Not making any major commitments to any one unit type means that you can just be freely spamming the best things that you want. So hopefully we don't see a whole bunch of armies just lean into the exact same choices and army building being a bit stale. One thing that might help a bit with this is that they're saying that many datasheet abilities have some sort of single use ability on them that you can only basically use once in an army each turn, and then further copies of that same unit are going to have diminishing returns. I think they mentioned, for example, that say you might have a Space Marine captain that can use one of his buffing rules, but even if you had multiple captains, you wouldn't be able to use it twice. Therefore, you're probably not going to want to spam captains, maybe take one captain and then, say, a chaplain or librarian after that. In effect, this is kind of similar game design to what the stratagems had before, as you were only able to use them once per phase. That again encouraged you to take multiple different units, as if you take two of the same unit and there's only one great stratagem, you're going to have one unit affected by that, but not the other. Hopefully when it all comes together, we still get some interesting and varied army builds. I think it just would be a bit of a shame if everyone's running the same thing. It's certainly simpler and very easy to understand. Hopefully they haven't gone too far with that. Next up, and something that was really quite cool to see, is a new example of 10th edition datasheets. I might make a follow-up video looking through this bit by bit, but here we have the new datasheet for Tyranid Termagants. I'm guessing that this is looking like it's the digital format that we'll be able to download. As you can see, some things are looking rather different here, though some things are kind of similar. Perhaps the most major shift is that we've got a whole bunch of things that are moved from the top stat line to the individual attack stat lines. Most notably, ballistic skill and weapon skill are down with the attacks rather than on the main unit stat line. I guess that opens up the possibility of some things being easier and harder to hit with without having to write special rules for it. You could have a Space Marine Power Fist that has a weapon skill of 4 plus, whereas if they hit you with a Power Sword, they'll hit you on 3s. The same has happened for the base strength of the unit, that is now included on the melee weapons profile, so the Termagants have some Xenos claws and teeth, one attack hitting on a 4 plus, with strength 3, AP 0, and damage 1. It still seems that we've got toughness and the saving throw the same as we had before. One wound, the leadership has now got an 8 plus on it. My guess would be that we're probably going for some sort of leadership type check when you test on 2d6 and see if you beat the number. Complete speculation, of course, but maybe 8 plus might be a fail on that amount. Otherwise, the new stat that's on the datasheet appears to be OC. I don't think that they specifically told us what this one stands for. They said that it relates to objectives, so maybe objective control might be the most likely thing. Different models are going to count for different numbers of points on objectives. The Termagants count for 2, and this is apparently going to be replacing the objective secured system that we have at the moment, so I'd guess that troops will have an inflated number for this, which is why these guys probably get 2. I feel like if they were maybe a fast attack choice, they might only be a 1 perhaps. Otherwise, looking through their weapons, we've got the profiles for the Flesh Borer, the Spine Fist, and the Devourer. I probably wouldn't read too much massively into the stats here, as we're dealing with an entirely new game with different combat profiles for every unit. They did say that in general the lethality has been toned down a bit though. It does seem that a few of these have lost a little bit. The Flesh Borer no longer has one of its pips of AP, I wouldn't be too surprised if they hammer the AP system a bit more back to how it was before, as opposed to the inflation that it had throughout 8th and 9th. Otherwise, keywords look a little bit simpler as well. The faction keyword for this one is now just Tyranids, and for the other ones we've got Great Devourer, Endless Multitude as they have at the moment, and Termagants, plus Infantry. It doesn't look like there's any core keyword on this one, as was in 9th. Otherwise, in their abilities section, it's fairly simple. Tyranids get a Synapse keyword. I'd guess that the index rules are probably going to be pretty simple compared with the big layered rules that we have at the moment. We might not have things like synaptic imperatives for Tyranids as they have right now. Finally, they've got a datasheet rule called Skulking Horrors, which looks like it could be almost a stratagem replacement type thing here. Once per turn, when an enemy unit ends a normal, advance, or a fall back move within 9 inches of this unit, if this unit is not within engagement range of one or more enemy units, it can make a normal move of up to d6 inches. This one very much feels like a bit of a reaction type mechanic like you get in Horus Heresy. Apparently there's going to be a few more of these to give the other person something to do while the opponent is making their plays. And I guess the idea is to shift some of the rules bulk from stratagems onto datasheets, so more things are just baked in rules of the unit, as opposed to things that you have to manage a endless resource of loads of different options. Still though, if they do have a whole ton of these reaction type mechanics, it could get a bit gotchery. Say for example, if your opponent forgets that your Termagants have this and then they move a unit nearby, and all of a sudden you could do something critical like block them off or jump onto an objective, and then you might get the bit of bad feeling that comes from them making a play that they obviously wouldn't have done if they actually knew that this rule existed. Still though, it's definitely not all bad, and it could be a bit more engaging in gameplay. Otherwise, for datasheet type things, they mentioned a few other bits. They did mention for the objective controlling stat that it would get bigger for certain other units, say for example having models like Imperial Knights scoring quite a bit more. I'd guess it's going to be weighted towards the things that currently have objectives secured and Games Workshop feel should secure objectives better. They'll get more points compared with things that don't. Otherwise, the other thing that they mentioned was for the toughness statistic. Apparently this is going to be stretched out a bit more than it currently is in 8th and 9th. The toughest things around generally have around about toughness 8 or toughness 9 at the moment. That's apparently going to be higher, with some vehicles going up to toughness 12 or more. We don't know if they're going to be messing around with the strength versus toughness comparison chart at all, or just keeping it as it is. But if they did keep it similar to how it is at the moment, that would mean that mid-strength anti-tank weapons aren't going to be quite as good against everything. They mentioned that weapons like plasma guns might be a whole lot less general purpose, very good at killing medium vehicles and elite infantry, but not so good at killing heavy tanks with the high toughness that they might be wounding on 5s. Finally, they gave us some previews for a trio of different game modes. First up, the 40k boarding actions one, and I think it'll be good news for a fair few people to confirm that the boarding patrols rules will be updated to work with 10th edition, so they aren't just doing a big rug pull on this and moving swiftly on. I feel like this is really quite a good move, and probably something that Games Workshop in ages past just wouldn't have bothered with. Maybe just saying that if you want to play boarding patrols, then play 9th edition rules with it. So it's good that they're keeping that updated with all the fancy and shiny Space Hulk terrain that you might want to pick up. I think confirming that early is probably good enough for their own sales of it as well. It means that a few more people might actually adopt it if they know that it's not going away in the very imminent future. Otherwise, perhaps one of the more surprising updates of the entire stream was that combat patrols are being redone. This is Combat Patrol, the game mode, which is currently basically just 40k but at 500 point chunks. I'm sure you'll still be able to play regular 40k at a low points level if you want to, but apparently now Combat Patrol is going to refer to something quite specific, a game of Warhammer played with the actual Combat Patrol boxes that they sell pitted against each other and somewhat balanced for a gameplay experience. They're trying to pitch this in a similar sort of way to how they have their Kill Team boxes. When you buy one of those, you buy one specific set team that you can equip in different ways, and then you have those models to fight against your enemies. I must admit, my first reaction of this is to quite like it, to be honest. I feel like it's going to be a really easy jumping off point for people to get into Warhammer 40k, and their aim is apparently for each faction to have their Combat Patrol box set, and then to have the rules somewhat balanced, so it should be a kind of level playing field between the different patrol forces when they're played against each other in a more casual setting. I'm sure it won't be super duper perfect or anything. The rules will be altered a bit and slimmed down even compared with regular 40k, but it sounds like it could be a really easy jumping off point if you wanted to dip a toe in 40k the main game, so hopefully they managed to implement this kind of well. Finally, last but not least, there was kind of limited info as to narrative stuff in this preview, but apparently Crusade is going to still be a thing. The initial expansion for it is going to be around the 4th Tyrannic War. It seems like they're still going to be keeping this as the main theme for narrative 40k going forward, but I suppose we'll have a few more details as to how it might work as they keep on with their previews. They were always going to be doing narrative 40k in one way or another. It does seem that they are keeping with the Crusade theme though, as in general have had some fairly positive feedback about it. So anyway, that's all rather a lot. 10th edition 40k is indeed here. We're getting new Space Marines against Tyranids, and we've got a huge amount of rules previews, indexes confirmed, simplified rules and datasheets, very simplified army construction, and a few other things that seem like fairly sensible changes beyond that. Let me know your initial thoughts though. I'm certainly looking forward to digging into everything a bit deeper when we get more details, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more. Of course, that wasn't the only big reveal of the Adepticon streams. If you'd like to check out my video on Lionel Johnson finally being revealed, then I'll link that down in the video description. Otherwise, if you have been finding these news and updates interesting, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's what allows me to keep on making these videos quite so regularly, staying up till late at night to get all the juicy previews done. If you have been enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.